Ladies and gentlemen, please meet Professor Yaneer Bar-Yam from New England Complex Systems Institute, President, Founder, Professor Yaneer.
Thank you very much. And sorry, I don't see the translation mode, but I hope you can hear me and you receive the translation, which is essential. So I know that the program is on artificial intelligence. I've been working in the area of complexity science, and the challenge of complexity science extends from human intelligence to artificial intelligence and collective intelligence. The difficulties that we are facing today are in the realm of understanding how do we respond to environmental challenges. And in order to respond, and I'm talking about the pandemic in particular, but the question of how do we respond has to do with really what is the fundamental nature of what it means to understand things. And in essence, the challenge is about generalization. How do we generalize from existing experience to new experiences? And the generalization process is really the process that we're trying to solve in understanding both all of these domains of artificial intelligence, human understanding how people think, and also collective intelligence. And I want to point at one particular idea, and then I'm going to go into the discussion of how we are responding to the pandemic as a key example. But the key idea is that intelligence is not in fundamental sense universal. And the basis of the field of artificial intelligence as a discipline is rooted in the idea of universality. Universality is the idea that the same algorithm, the same computational framework, the same computational paradigm is applicable to all circumstances. Many years ago, I worked on thinking about the architecture of intelligence as a collective process of neurons in the brain. And the conclusion that we came to was that it's not universal. It's not universal in the sense that you have to actually choose the structure of the system that will be suited to the challenge or the environmental circumstance that one is facing. And this statement shifts what we have to do from thinking about intelligence as something that we understand as a fundamental mathematical construct to understanding the relationship between particular architectures of intelligence and specific challenges that are presented by the real world. Now, this is a long topic and a large discussion, but I actually want to just use the pandemic as an example of how this manifests the challenge of intelligence, and ask, if we were intelligent, what would we have done 2 years ago, or even longer ago, in view of what we've learned from the pandemic over the last 2 years? And the answer is that we would have surely done many different things. And why didn't we? And the answer has to do with both understanding and action. And the understanding part has to do with the fact that individuals as collection of neurons and society as a collection of individuals is not structured or has not yet been structured in a way that will enable it to effectively respond to the circumstance that we are facing. If we were, then we would have. That's quite clear. And the fact that we didn't points to this statement that we need different structures, different cognitive structures, as well as different social structures that would enable us to effectively respond to the circumstance. How do we develop them? Well, at the very least, learning is a process of rewiring neurons in the brain and rewiring the synapses that are connecting them. And it also, in this context, has to be the development of new structures, organizational processes that would enable us to respond effectively to a pandemic. And I want to just point out that in this fundamental sense, we have no choice but to create these organizational structures, to adopt an ideological stance that says, because of this and this idea about how society should function, we don't want to have organizational structures. We don't want to have decision-making processes in society that would violate those assumptions. We can call them ologies, or we can call them, right, all of the ideas about governance, the ideas about what rights an individual should have, or what responsibilities the individual should have versus the society should have. None of that matters very much if the consequence of the environmental circumstance is fatal. And in fact, the process ultimately of choosing the organizational structure of society or the way the brain works is evolutionary. And evolutionary processes succeed by being fatal, right? The way they succeed is by selecting the architectures that work in the context of the environmental circumstance that we face. And if we think about that very simply, we will realize very quickly that that inability to respond to pandemics in the world today will be fatal. There really isn't a model of the world that would allow us to survive without the ability to respond to pandemics. And if we, as societies and as a civilization, don't develop the mechanisms to respond, this is not a choice in the sense of we can't choose it and survive. We can choose it and fail to survive, but we cannot choose it what we want the structure should be, independent of the choice of whether we want to survive. And this message was actually something that I said in 2006 as a result of doing a quantitative modeling analysis of the nature and dynamics of pandemics, or more simply or generally of contagious diseases. The reason that this is something that we worked on is because we discovered that adding long-range transportation to a model of contagious diseases fundamentally led to the evolutionary dynamic of the disease of causing more and more lethal, rapidly spreading variants of the disease, with a resulting process that was unambiguous, without any additional mechanisms, i.e. a learning process that would react to what was going on without such additional mechanisms, the host, in this case human beings, would not survive. It would go extinct. Now, going extinct in this context is a global situation, because the global situation is the context of the analysis with transportation globally. So it's very straightforward. I can give you a reference that people can look at. But the basic idea, maybe Andre, you can find the reference and share it with others while I'm talking. The basic idea is that if you have local transportation, then the local transportation enables local extinction events to prevent the wide transportation of a disease. But if you have rapid transportation, then local extinction events are not the solution. Instead, a global extinction event is the solution to the existence of the pathogen. And that is the outcome that is expected if you have sufficient global transportation. And it happens even for relatively small amounts of global transportation compared to the underlying dynamics of the system. So to recap, we have a fundamental description of the system that tells us that the natural dynamics will lead to extinction if we have sufficient global transportation. What's the solution to the problem? The solution to the problem is clear. One has to treat global transportation as a control variable that can be used in the process of preventing the global extinction. How much travel you have, fundamental, as a regular process, and how much travel you have dynamically in response to the existence of a lethal, rapidly transmitting disease is determined by the need to prevent the global extinction event. Now, what have we seen in the last 2 years? In the last 2 years, we've seen exactly this model playing out on the global stage. We have rapid, highly transmitting disease, extensive global transportation, and the evolution of more and more rapidly transmitting and lethal variants. And that's exactly what the theory says. Now, the point is, the fact that the theory says this tells us that in principle, if we were intelligent enough as human beings, individually and collectively, we would then know what the solution is. The solution is obvious. We have to exert limits on the travel. We have to suppress the pandemic, and we have to achieve a state which is stable, which is the attractor of elimination, at which point we would not have to limit travel as much in a dynamical process. But the fact that we haven't done this, does it mean we are not intelligent? Perhaps. But what it does mean for sure is that we haven't developed the societal structure and mechanism to behave intelligently, because intelligence is not a universal process. It is a process that fundamentally depends on the environmental conditions under which we exist. And the environmental conditions under which we exist includes pandemics as a fundamental biological reality that connects to the social reality of the need to respond to pandemics. And now, given that this is the reality, yesterday and today, we have a new demonstration, very likely, of the appearance of a new variant, a variant that started or is amplified in South Africa, but is much more rapidly transmitting than Delta, as it is growing rapidly on the background of Delta. Likely, because of its more rapid transmission, the viral generation is much more rapid, which suggests, if not proves, that it will be more lethal and more harmful. And also that the vaccines that we have tried to rely on in order to avoid using travel restrictions and strong social action, those vaccines will not be effective or very much weakened to the point that they will be less effective than Delta. And the point, however, is that regardless of the specifics of the reality of this new variant, this one, the inability to respond to uncertainty, the lack of knowledge, as opposed to the existence of the need to respond to specific information, is essential. We have to respond to uncertainty, because by the time we gain specific knowledge, as we've experienced over the past 2 years, the situation is much, much worse than it would be otherwise. And this goes back to this business about non-universality, because the fundamental way that most artificial intelligence works today is by accumulating huge bodies of data that will enable us to know the consequences, if you will, or the desired mappings is the alternative formulation of the large, exponentially large space of possibilities. We have an exponentially large, in principle, space of possibilities of the real world. But the reason that it is not universal is because that space of possibilities is not actually that large. It is much reduced by the existence of patterns that are present in the data about the real world. So the choice of the non-universal architecture has to match the patterns that exist in the world. Just as in order to walk, we have to have internal mental representations of gravity and space and continuity and other things, so we need specific representations that enable us to understand the dynamics of pandemics and the need to respond in the absence, not in the presence, in the absence of certainty. And that's the solution in principle to the intelligence problem, having the right patterns be the ones that are present in our brains, and the right decision-making processes in society, and the right actions, including collective actions, that are needed in order to respond in this circumstance, and presumably in many other circumstances that are life-threatening. So just to bring this to a close, society requires, in order to survive, certain kinds of collective behaviors. It's not a choice. Society requires, or will require, in order to survive, the existence of decision-making processes based upon limited information. And it is now the responsibility of creating those mechanisms so that we can be successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yaneer. I hope you can hear the applause from the audience. I'm not sure if you can see the audience. And I will just pop one question regarding the last point you made. Would it be correct to say that the need for society to adapt to those general challenges requires people to not only do their personal individual learning on an individual basis, on the basis of the information that they face on a daily basis, but also recognize their responsibility to be part of the collective society-wide adoption to the challenges they face. And also that relates to the sharing of the data, in fact, in the public interest, in the interest of the society, being able to learn to adapt to the challenges.
Absolutely, and creating the structures that will enable this to happen is a societal challenge. We cannot at this point in time assume that any particular existing structure, whether it's medical institutions or whether it's governance institutions, will respond to this challenge. We have to assume that this is our challenge, not just to do the action, but also to create the organizational processes that will enable this to take place. And let me just mention that recognizing that it is today about creating organizational processes that has guided my efforts in the context of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I, with colleagues, put out a warning that we needed to act collectively. Once the existing society, the existing structures, governance processes did not react effectively, I've spent much of the pandemic working on creating what I hope will come to pass as being organizational systems that will enable the kind of data sharing, the kind of analysis, scientific analysis, technology, and information that ultimately is linked, and not hopefully ultimately, but soon is linked to the community response, because it's community-based response that is fundamentally the root of responding to the pandemic. To create all of these structures is a huge endeavor. But as I said, we either do it or we're not going to be around much longer. So it is upon us to create all of the technology and society, social and scientific processes that will enable this response to take place. Relying on the existing structures, as we tend to do, which is understandable because that's where we have to start, has not proven to be effective. So I hope that others will recognize this and join me. Right now, we've created, actually quite recently, as part of this effort, the World Health Network. And I invite others to look at what we are doing and hopefully to join us in making a global system that can respond to pandemics. Thank you.